Alright, guys, I am back. Alright, part 2 of the Malthusian Delusion. Okay, the dilettante and the huckster. Unlikely as it sounds, the dilettante threw himself into his new role as the world's first population control technocrat with almost evangelical fervor. He gathered the best minds on the subject together and trained more, building a global network of population experts who shared his antenatal views. He funded research to find easier, more reliable, and above all, more permanent ways of contracepting and sterilizing the poor. He established regional centers for demographic training, sorry, wow, great start, and research in Bombay, 1957, San Diego, 1958, and Cairo, 1963, and national centers in many countries, understanding these as stepping stones to instituting full-scale population control programs. Such centers and the experts they produced explain Frederick Osborne, his right-hand man at the council, stimulated recognition of the dangers of the too rapid growth of local populations. No doubt they did, since this was precisely why they were up in the first place. As time went on, Rockefeller got increasingly involved in the action programs as well, providing grants for the purchase of contraceptives as well as technical personnel to actually oversee their distribution in developing countries. He helped to set up national family planning programs in South Korea, Malaysia, Hong Kong, Ceylon, and elsewhere. But the most important thing he did, using his own funds and those of like-minded super rich, was to work quietly behind the scenes to help convince the U.S. federal government with its bottomless pockets to sign on to his agenda. Rockefeller would not have succeeded without the help of a man, Hugh Moore, and he came to detest that okay, the irresistible Moore had money too, but unlike the old money of the Rockefellers, he had made it himself, peddling the ideas of a paper cup into a multi-million-dollar manufacturing concern, the Dixie Cup Company, whose product was familiar to every American. I think this is like, in my memory, this is like a 90s thing. Like, this is very nostalgic. And Moore's epiphany on population did not come while on a grand tour to Asia, but in a distinctly pedestrian way while reading a book. Population Action Committee. The book was The Road to Survival, a hell-bent for leather account of the dangers of population written by William Vaux, the National Director of Planned Parenthood Federation of America. As Moore read how population growth was the basic cause of future wars and the spread of tyranny and communism, alarm bells went off in his head. Moore credited Vaux for really waking me up, and then and there decided to make population his sole concern. He formed the Population Action Committee and called for immediate mobilization against the impending crisis. Who among us, he used to shout at meetings, will come up with a plan for starting a conflagration? Wait, okay. According to his biographer, Lawrence Later, Moore's methods were often designed purposefully to stimulate controversy and thereby focus public attention. With time running out, people have to face raw facts. A warning should be shouted from the rooftops. Moore believed that people needed to be scared, really scared, in order to become aware of the disaster that loomed before them. And and what better way to scare them than with an image of a bomb and talk of an explosion? The bomb had leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the early 50s, the Soviets had it too, and the Cold War was in full swing. America anguished over the thoughts of bombs, their explosive power no longer expressed in tons, but megatons, ready to lay waste to the world. Moore deliberately played on these fears with a pamphlet called The Population Bomb, which he mailed to 1,000 leaders in business and the professions. It declared that today the population bomb threatens to create an explosion as disruptive and dangerous as the explosion of the atom, and with as much influence as prospects for progress or disaster, war or peace. The coming population explosion will be the mother of all calamities, leading to widespread famine and crushing tax rates, the spread of communism and a scourge of war, plus every other imaginable environmental and social ill in between. All this was written in what later calls a whiplash phraseology that stung a dormant public, eager to convince others of the correctness of his cause. More inflated future human numbers to justify his radical plan to restrict human fertility. The hype was nowhere more evident than on the booklet's cover. It featured a drawing of a world teeming with humanity, with standing room only on all continents. Africa, already the prime target of the population controllers, was front and center. Coming out of North Pole was a lit fuse. A pair of scissors with long, sharp blades were poised to cut it off. The scissors were labeled Population Control. Population bomb myth grows. The controversy sparked by the publication of the pamphlet delighted the huckster and more. Over the next decade and a half, he mailed free of charge hundreds of thousands of copies of the booklet to every group of politicians, educators, officials, journalists, and people of influence he could think of. One of 500,000 copies later, this relentless promoter had made the population bomb the doomsday metaphor of choice. He had engraved the image of mushroom clouds of people boiling up from the surface of the planet in an unconstrained frenzy of procreation and the consciousness of most on the consciousness of most Americans. He had convinced many that population control would stop the spread of communism, and he had captured the imagination of a young butterfly expert by the name of Paul Ehrlich, who later asked to borrow the title for his own book on the dangers of population. Okay, so this teeming, boiling over metaphor, this was also used to justify the yellow peril, which I have talked about in other videos, specifically in terms of the new population scare being Arabs. At least it's more pronounced in that way, since Middle Eastern world has always been rather controversial, whether it's the information that is kept secret and writing and other things like that. It's very, very, I don't know, it's hard to explain. I guess that's why we're sucking it dry of its oil. Okay. Rockefeller was one of the first to receive a copy of the population bomb, along with a letter of explanation from Hugh Moore. We are not primarily interested in the sociological or humanitarian aspects of birth control, Moore wrote. We are interested in the use which communists make of hungry people in their drive to conquer the earth. Rockefeller and his circle were predictably offended by both Moore's crude style and his alarmist rhetoric. Frederick Osborne worried that Moore's Madison Avenue techniques might set the population control movement back 10 years and argued that distribution of the pamphlet be halted. Low-key and scientific-minded, Rockefeller fretted that phrases like population explosion, population bomb might create an atmosphere of panic. One can almost hear Moore chuckle, since panic was precisely what he was trying to provoke. Well, Rockefeller, as a rich person, probably doesn't want to lose out on money, even though he has all the money in the world to just do whatever he wants to do, since he's so bored. At least that line specifically. Alright. A media blitz. Although Rockefeller for some time had been convinced that the federal government needed to get involved in population control, it was the outspoken Moore who paved the way. When his old friend William H. Draper was appointed by President Eisenhower to chair a committee to study foreign aid, Moore seized his chance. He saturated the Wall Street financer and other committee members with material on the dangers of overpopulation, arguing that economic aid was being nullified by population growth. When the Draper Report appeared in 1959, it was the first official government report to endorse population control. In 1961, the U.S. Congress was considering a major foreign aid bill. Moore launched an advertising campaign in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Washington Post, and Time magazine. Among the earliest ads were two designed to put the nation's first Catholic president, who had earlier rejected the Draper Report, on the spot, in Moore's phrase. The full-page ads were headlined "An Appeal to President Kennedy" and called for the federal government to address the population explosion. Draper, at Moore's urging, returned to Washington and undertook one-man lobbying campaign for the cause, with Rockefeller and his colleagues also working behind the scenes to encourage federal intervention. These wealthy men were about to impose their will on the U.S. Congress. It would in turn impose its will on the world. Applying the economic lash, the U.S. Foreign Assistance Act of 1961 represented a radical departure from previous notions of foreign aid, such as feeding the hungry or arming our allies, because it took population control as a fundamental aim. So, this piece of history we don't hear about how we're trying to control other people's populations. Maybe this is why the nations have been failing recently, because there's just a lack of trust, because you're deliberately trying to have leverage over them. Alright. The Congress declares that the individual liberties, economic prosperity, and security of the people of the United States are best sustained and enhanced in a community of nations which work together to use wisely the world's limited resources in an open and equitable international economic system. Development assistance shall be concentrated in countries which make the most effective use of such assistance. The President shall assess the commitment and the progress of countries by utilizing criteria including control of population growth. The effect of this language was to enshrine in the U.S. law two core beliefs of the population control movement, namely that population growth is a national security issue and that foreign aid should be given chiefly to countries which control it. A subsequent provision of the bill is even more radical, for it enlists all U.S. aid programs, from education and health to rural development and disease control, into the war on people. Quote, all appropriate activities proposed for financing under this chapter integration of assistance programs shall be designed to build motivation for smaller families through modification of economic and social conditions supportive of the desire for large families, in progress such as education in and out of school, nutrition, disease control, maternal and child health services, improvements in the status and employment of women, agricultural production, rural development, and assistance to the urban poor, and through community development programs. There's a question that most people should be thinking, and this question was asked in the last reading of Markets and Malthus that my husband read. But do you think that there's there's Malthusians in America running how our population works? I would have to say not really. Now, I would say that the pronatalism and the antinatalism are in the hands of the Malthusian, because obviously the U.S. is the dominant force in the globe that happened to put foreign aid across everywhere. So I would say yes and no. No, because they're not trying to destroy their own economy within, even though financially we have been incentivized down to have smaller families and think of our individuality as different for better or worse. Now, I value my freedom. I'm not saying that it's not a good thing, except, again, these are the morals we learned along the way, as I have said. Alright. Alright. The reason for foreign aid. Those who thought that U.S. foreign aid was principally intended to feed the hungry, reduce the incidence of disease or promote economic development was mistaken. The proper end of all foreign aid, according to this and some subsequent laws, was nothing other than fertility reduction. Governments which wanted access to U.S. foreign assistance had to not only agree to control their population growth, but also to accept programs consciously designed to shrink family size and reduce fertility rates. The 1961 bill was Maoist-style social engineering at its worst, but the moderate and conservative American politicians mostly voted for it, convinced as they were by Moore, Draper, and others that in stopping the birth of babies were stopping the spread of communism. So, yeah, I know they're like uh, the where you got to start is stopping childbirth, but I don't know if when we say anti-natalist, it's literally they hate like they despise babies. It's just the specific demographics procreation. Now, I know this is semantics. I don't even know why I'm saying this, but I feel like there should be a distinction made here. No one's literally out here hating babies. It's a it's a value judgment of the location. All right. The Dark Legacy of Dr. Raymond T. Ravenholt, Population Caesar. Malthusians. Malthusianism, that monstrous doctrine of unreason, as Paul Johnson has called it, was now official U.S. policy. The U.S. had made it its business to stop women in the developing world from having too many children. We, not they, would define how many was too many. To carry out this sweeping mandate, the Office of Population was to set up within the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, in 1966, and the doctor by the name of Raymond Thorolf Ravenholt was appointed as its first director. How? What? Like, just look at that name. That's literally an evil motherfucker. Like this person's name is like giving off skull shapes of evil. All right. Dr. Ravenholt had massive amounts of aid money at his disposal, the State Department at his beck and call, and, of course, a mandate for Congress itself. No ordinary bureaucrat, he was to become a law unto himself, a population czar, if you will. By the end of his tenure in 1979, Ravenholt had put too firmly in place the powerful interlocking directorate of U.S. funding population control organization that continues to assault people around the world today. Who was Dr. Ravenholt? An epidemiologist by training, he apparently looked upon pregnancy as a disease. Two, he eradicated in the same way one eliminates smallpox or yellow fever. He was also, as it happened, a bellicose misanthrope. So, I think for women who don't want children, it might be considered a disease. And I think for women who want to talk that way about their own bodies in terms of not wanting to be pregnant, that is absolutely fine. And I've joked about pregnancy being a type of disease, which it kind of puts a bad taste in your mouth knowing that there's this psychopath Ravenholt behind this rhetoric. Okay. He took his work of contracepting, sterilizing, and aborting the women of the world with an aggressiveness that caused his younger colleagues to shrink back in disgust. His business cards were printed on condoms, and he delighted in handing them out to all comers. Uh, he talked incessantly about how to distribute greater quantities of birth control pills and ensure that they were used. He advocated mass sterilization campaigns, once telling St. Louis Post-Dispatch that 1/4 of all the fertile women in the world must be sterilized in order to meet U.S. goals of population control and to maintain the normal operations of U.S. commercial interests around the world. Such rigorous measures were required, Ravenholt explained, to contain the population explosion, which, if left unchecked, so reduced living standards abroad that revolutions would break out against the strong U.S. commercial presence. It's kind of a very specific thing they would do just because of the population explosion. Oh, look, big numbers. Oh, look, it's the U.S. Like, maybe there's a reasons for that specifically, and this has nothing to do with big numbers. And this is why we need borders, because we are the enemy, and we openly sterilize people abroad. So of course, like, it makes sense that there's been sort of a pushback against anti-border stuff in light of all this. Okay. No need for general health care. Ravenholt denounced those at USAT and elsewhere who argued that the proper end of U.S. assistance was economic development or social reform, saying dismissively that the one thing people don't seem to want to do is family planning. He declared that the biggest threat to mass population programs stems from revisionist tendencies promulgated by those unduly concerned with irrelevant issues of social policy or even general health care. His enemies responded that he had a myopic focus on population control and bellicose personal style. Charming he was not. At a dinner for population researchers, Ravenholt strolled around the room making pumping motions with his fist as if he were operating a manual vacuum uh, aspirator, a handheld vacuum pump for performing abortions, to the horror of other guests. Okay, definitely a psychopath. Okay. Like nearly all population controllers, he saw abortions as an essential element of his anti-people strategy, human rights as secondary, and people of religious sentiments as opponents. He condemned religious opposition to birth control for greatly aggravating Africa's population programs. Most harmful to Africa has been the Helms Amendment, authored by Catholic zealots, blocking provision of much-needed abortion services. So, the antinatalists are sick in the head, but the religious people who just would have children pop out of women no matter the circumstances of their health, these are Catholics that probably like there's a fertility cult that does need to be stopped by contraceptives, but and so I don't think all these like third world people being attacked by religious institutions are necessarily like acting on their own free will. Again, I mean, this mostly really depends, like, the youngest you are giving birth. Although that's, again, this is where, like, the morals came in despite the arbitrarity of the age to just keep pushing it back until her childbearing years are dwindled and you never had to sterilize or abort. You just had to say no and use abstinence. But on the flip side, it's just psychopaths telling you to have less children because that makes you strong and you know. All right, getting ahead of myself, unfortunately. Also, religious fanatics in the Congress have further uh, uh, vitiated U.S. population program assistance. Access to abortion is important in every land to enable individual women to avoid bearing unwanted children. Exactly, obviously. But Africa must now urgently choose between making abortion services generally available or accepting catastrophic increase in the killing fields. Okay, so this is where it's not true because instead of helping the issues, the war-torn devastation, instead of fixing that, make engineer the population down so less people are affected by these disparities that you won't fix. So it makes it look better. I mean, it really doesn't, but to them it's a win-win because while you contracept their numbers down, whatever's killing them will take out the rest. But that hasn't happened at all. So, all right. In other words, if you don't kill children in utero, they will kill each other after birth because of the stresses of over. Oh my God. So this is a flat out just unthinking statement right there. And this is where don't fix the disparities and just lower the numbers comes into play. Like, this is flat out just saying that. You know, can you imagine, like, Hitler 2.0 is happening and starts, like, World War 3, and it's like, okay, well, you know what will settle this? Just kill the citizens so that Hitler 2.0 doesn't kill them. Like, what? Okay. Birth control and public safety. Ravenholt was an apologetic Malthusian who was not only believed that birth control was the key to public safety, freedom from hunger, and development, but argued against interventionist medical programs to save the lives of infants and children. The birth rates must be driven down first, or at least simultaneously. He offered the following summary of his point of view. The main admonition to be made to those persons and organizations in advanced nations wishing to help the Africans is beware, do not harm the communities and nations you seek to help with public health programs. Unfortunately, that admonition has often been neglected by those seeking to help the Africans. A main case in point is the powerful interventionist prevention of infant and child mortality by the many means of our society now readily offers. Grants of food, uh, potable waters, antibiotics, immunization, etc. How could these be harmful? Quite simply, they are enormously harmful to African societies when the deaths prevented thereby are not balanced by prevention of a uh, roughly equal number of births. It is the population excesses resulting from well-intentioned but population unbalanced interventionist activities which are largely uh, driving today's killing fields in Africa. Many infants and children rescued from preventable diseases deaths by interventionist programs during the 1970s and 1980s have become machete-wielding killers. Okay, I don't know about that one. But I can agree that empathy does sort of backfire. I can agree it from this perspective, but that's about that. Public health interventionalists for Africa must learn from the benefit of or harm of every proposed health interventionist program is inescapably dependent upon whether it aggravates or improves the population situation. They must not blithely assume that if their interventionist programs only increase the child population by 10%, it does no harm. And this is just the flip side of harming someone in a different way. As I said, leaving the disparities. So eventually you just have the disparities killing off 10 people or something instead of like 10 million. Which is just really sad when you say it like that. You haven't really solved anything. As the U.S. population czar, Ravenholt did not set out to organize a huge in-house population control bureaucracy to achieve his goals of eliminating excess people. Rather, after the American fashion, he collaborated with existing organizations like the International Planned Parenthood Federation, the Population Council, the Association for Voluntary Sterilization, AVS, more recently, and Gender Health, to carry out family planning programs in countries overseas. He selected he selected small organizations to play specific, highly specialized roles, providing them with grants that were often 10 times or more their previous annual budgets. The structure set up by Ravenholt thus resembles a conglomerate, with headquarters, you said, directing its various subsidiaries in different steps in the manufacturing, testing, marketing, and delivery of its wide array of antenatal products. Once the pipeline was in place, Ravenholt quickly became the largest conveyor of condoms, birth control pills, and other contraceptives in the world. The sheer number of devices he and his successors have shipped over time is staggering. From 1968 to 1995, the Office of Population shipped more than 10.5 billion condoms, over 2 billion cycles of abortifacient birth control pills, more than 73 million abortifacient IUDs and other 116 million vaginal foaming tablets to the undeveloped countries of the Third World. In the 90s, the abortifacients Norplant and Depo-Provera were added to the arsenal, and by 1995 nearly a quarter of a million units of Norplant and almost 4 million doses of Depo-Provera have been shipped. With the exception of Norplant, all of these devices are sourced in the U.S., which you said has not hesitated to point out to congressmen skeptical of the merit of the program. How the money was spent. From 1968 to 1995, the Office of Population spent more than 1.5 billion to buy, test, store, ship, and deliver contraceptive and abortifacient devices. Less than a third of this actually went to purchase condoms, pills, and injectables. The rest of the money went for shipping, testing, and above all, marketing them. USAID currently uses Panalpina, an international shipping firm, to provide for the warehouses of contraceptives worldwide, as well as for shipping container loads of condoms and other contraceptives deteriorate quickly in the tropical heat and humidity. So USAID has been paying closer attention in storage in recent years. For its services, Panalpina received almost 24 million from 1992 to 1997. Contraceptives are tested by North California firm Family Health International, which is under contract to verify that the quality of contraceptive products, such as condoms, pills, shipped by USAID to other countries, meet strict standards. Marketing contraception. But the real challenge for Ravenholt was in marketing these devices to weary third world couples, contrary to population control propaganda about a huge unmet need for contraception among the world's people. The actual demand for these drugs and devices is quite low. The poor, of course, do have real unmet needs for practically everything else besides contraceptives, but lest the devices languish in run-down warehouses until their expiration date and have to be thrown away, a not uncommon fate, the population czar developed highly sophisticated distribution, promotional, and advertising campaigns still in use today to rush them into the local population. Physician-dominated health programs were the favored approach, but these often failed to increase contraceptive prevalence. The percentage of couples contracepting in countries where doctors' visits were a rarity, or where most physicians refused to collaborate. If this happened, Ravenholt would turn to community-based programs, which hired facilitators would be paid a bounty for finding acceptors. At the same time, social marketing programs would be brought in, where street vendors and shopkeepers of all kinds were trained to hand out contraceptives with other purchases. Massive programs of contraceptive social marketing are still used today to motivate people in places like Kenya and Nigeria to accept and use the great quantities of contraceptives that Ravenholt's successors at USAID think that they need. Other programs relied upon advertising and entertainment. USAID's chief condom pusher, for example, an organization called Population Services International, uses aggressive and ubiquitous advertising campaigns to flood the media with pro-condom message. These campaigns involve to use PSI's own martial language, the constant barrage of radio spots and films shown on television in cinema halls and on PSI's fleet of mobile film vans, all strolling the virtues and benefits of condom usage. Like the loudspeakers that bleated the thought of Chairman Mao all day long in Chinese communes, there would be seen to be no escape from these forced feedings of antenatal propaganda. Radio soap operas and the traveling puppet shows are also utilized to spread the word. In Bangladesh, according to PSI, the audience turnout among the entertainment starved rural populations to enormous averaging 3,500 and 4,000 viewers per show. On some occasion, as many as 10,000 people have been known to turn out. To further drive home the message, during the intermission break, the contraceptive promoter passes out party favors, simple products such as oral contraceptive pills or condoms. Population control. Population control! Throughout his long tenure in office, Ravenholt maintained his single-minded focus on controlling population growth by contracepting, sterilizing, and aborting as many women as possible. He was impressed by China's startling success in the population control, saw it as an expression of the collective will of the people, and claimed that it had been brought about by peer pressure. He considered himself to be above the law and would not take no for an answer. If democratically elected governments refused family planning assistance, Ravenholt did an end run around them, funding non-government organizations in their countries to carry out population control activities, or quietly funding organizations to come in from abroad. If staff members went to a country that forbid contraceptives, sterilizations, or abortion, they were expected to smuggle in as much contraband as they could. Although he left office in 1979, 2 decades later, his dark legacy lives on. As the Population Reference Bureau recently confirmed, quote, Ravenholt began a program that has devoted $8 billion to population and reproductive health, while today's program differs from his, especially in its emphasis on reproductive health, which itself is largely a fig leaf for family planning. Its problematic underpinnings remain Ravenholt's. Ravenholt himself concurs with this statement. During the last 2 decades of dedicated believers in the USAID mission of providing assistance for curbing excess fertility and population growth in the less developed world, have worked to keep alive as much as possible of the population program we created at USAID during the 1970s. Okay. Alright, I am so glad I got this over with. And I do want to read these endnotes, but I think I might have to cut this short. I don't really think Ravenholt's legacy necessarily lingers in the U.S. As I said, it's kind of semantics if you think pronatalism or antinatalism is in the U.S. because the Malthusian it mostly does pronatalism to its countries. So, and there was another point I had, but um, yeah, I'll be back in the next one, guys.